The end of the pandemic is in sight. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. It's raised its forecast for global growth this year thanks to the speedy rollout of vaccines and generous stimulus programs by large economies. But as Paolo Montecillo reports, not everyone is expected to emerge from the crisis at the same time.
Coronavirus shots in millions of arms and the fresh round of stimulus from the government. Those are proving to be an effective recipe for a strong recovery in the world's largest economy.
We are in the midst of an economic recovery in the U.S. right now that is enabled by the supply of vaccines, which continues to rise, and then, of course, emboldened consumer confidence.
The optimism is shared by the International Monetary Fund, which has unveiled a set of rosier forecasts for 2021. The IMF expects the global economy to grow 6% this year. That's up from its 5.5% forecast in January. Among rich nations, the U.S. will lead the rebound with an expected expansion of more than 6% versus the old projection of 5%. China is seen leading emerging markets with a growth of as much as 8.4%, better than the previous 8.1% prediction.
This reflects the additional fiscal support provided in the United States, vaccination efforts that are going to lead to a strengthening of recovery in the second half of this year, and also the continued resilience of economic activity to the pandemic in many parts of the world.
With a return to pre-pandemic output in sight, the U.S. is focusing on chipping away at the extra debt it's incurred in the past year. Washington is calling for a minimum tax rate for G20 economies to prevent large corporations from moving their headquarters to places with lower duties.
Together, we can use a global minimum tax to make sure the global economy thrives based on a more level playing field in the taxation of multinational corporations and spurs innovation, growth, and prosperity.
Meanwhile, the IMF is warning poor nations will have a longer road to recovery. The lender says the US and China are faring well because of their rapid rollout of vaccines. The two account for nearly half of all doses that have been administered globally.
They are part of a small group of countries that will be well ahead of their pre-crisis GDP levels by the end of 2021. But they are the exception, not the rule.
The IMF says the pandemic is expected to cost rich nations around 11% of their GDP. The impact on developing countries will be nearly twice as hard, with output expected to be 20% lower than if the crisis had never hit. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
For more, let's go to Christian Lawrence. He's a senior cross-asset strategist at Rabobank in New York. Welcome to the show. Now, the government's stimulus spending, as we heard from Paolo's report there, is a major driver for the US, for the EU and other advanced economies. Which sectors do you perceive will be the biggest winners here?
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, most of the focus on the fiscal stimulus so far has really been aimed at trying to bolster households, trying to support their balance sheets, so that consumption can spring back very rapidly indeed. And of course, there's been a lot of help for small businesses as well. That being said, the ultra low interest rates, the stimulus from central banks, that's provided a lot of cheap financing for large companies as well. And what we're seeing at the moment in the US is the recovery, particularly when we look at the stock market, has become far more broad-based. We are seeing small caps doing well, and we are seeing the very large companies doing well.
Now, as you mentioned, there's a lot of money being printed and doled out by these central banks and the governments. Do you expect any significant positive flows to emerging economies like we saw in the aftermath of the 2009 crisis, perhaps?
Well, we certainly did see that last year with yields so low in the US when we saw the 10-year close to 50 basis points. We saw huge inflows into emerging market currencies as people tried to capture some yield pickup. The trouble now is as we're seeing US rates start to rise, all of a sudden that extra pickup has become much smaller. And as some of the reports just noted, different emerging markets are going to perform very differently going forward, depending on how hard they were hit by COVID and what sort of infrastructure they have to roll out the vaccine as fast as possible. So I think most of the easy inflows we had already seen, and now things are going to become a lot more selective, looking at countries individually, which are going to perform better than others over the next 12 months. So we've moved out of that world where all emerging markets, financial markets, were moving in lockstep together. We will see greater differentiation going forward.
And as you mentioned, the IMF's outlook isn't all rosy. It's warning of higher income disparity, especially for women, for young people, for low or unskilled workers. How much of a threat do you perceive that to be for long-term economic stability or even political stability?
Well, you're quite right. When we look at the US specifically, those in low-income households have been hit so much harder than the billionaires at the top. This is the way recessions normally work, but this has been far more pronounced. And if we expand that to the globe, again, it's the situation where poorer countries are certainly going to struggle more. Now, back to the US, one of the reasons why we've seen another round of stimulus from the Biden administration is specifically to help those low-income households. Yes, the labor market is recovering, but there's still quite a long way to go. And it's easy to forget just how hard those at the bottom have been hit. And there will be economic scarring. If you like, the boost that we're seeing from the fiscal side at the moment, it's almost like a sudden boost that will start to fade as the year passes. And we'll really start to see who's been hit the hardest and what sort of long-lasting structural scarring will be caused by the COVID vaccine. It isn't a question of just going back to how things were before.
So in other words, some of the most vulnerable groups that were hardest hit by the pandemic could be the last ones to recover. Kristen Lawrence, thank you so much for your analysis there.